Welcome to Parsons Family Preserve. My name is Ann Dorney, and I'm the part of the Somerset Woods Trustees, which owns this property. The property was given to us by the Parsons family about 8 years ago. The original Parsons farmhouse was right down the road. We're on the Malbins Mills Road in Skowhegan. And the Parsons family really wanted to protect this land so that it would be forever wild. The property is about 27 acres and almost all of it is a field, so sometimes people call it Parsons Field. So I am the second steward of this property, and when we acquired the property, we decided to make it a pollinator garden. That was our intent. So the first few years we planted a few flowers on the field, and since then we've been doing something called rewilding. So hopefully by the time you're done with this, you'll know some terms you may not know before. You know a little bit about rewilding, and you can hopefully appreciate what we're trying to do. So we're basically, as you may know, in a situation in the US and around the world where we're having decreasing numbers of pollinators, we're having decreasing numbers of birds, and what I hope to be able to tell you and explain to you is that we all can do something about that. So some of the things that I'm trying to do on Parsons, you can do in your own yard or in your own woods, and hopefully you'll understand better about why it's important. So just to be aware, I'm not an entomologist or an insect person. I'm not formally trained in botany. I am not a horticulturalist, but but I know a lot about nature. I know a lot about birds. I've been bird watching since I was in college. And I'm learning my insects as much as I can. And hopefully I'll show you some tools of kinds of things that I'm doing on Parsons that can help with that. So one of the things that I do is I talk about what we were doing for Parsons at first. So Parsons was being taken over by chokecherries. So it was basically a field that had been previously used for grazing, at least part of it, and was being taken over by chokecherries. So what people were doing was just mowing it once a year, usually late summer or fall, just to keep the chokecherries down. And then I started reading about chokecherries. I started reading about keystone plants, which we'll explain in a minute. And the interesting thing about chokecherries is cherries are a keystone plant. So there's certain species of plants, which include species of trees and species of flowers, that are especially good for the environment, especially good for insects. And there's some plants, like about 5% of plants, that actually support most of our butterflies and moths, for instance, almost all of them. So if you don't have keystone species in your environment, your ecosystem suffers. And when we're talking about rewilding, we're not talking about necessarily trying to return something to what it was, because we don't know what it was, say 100 years ago or 200 years ago, right? But we're trying to restore a working ecosystem so that the insects thrive, the birds thrive, and other animals will thrive as well. So I realized that we actually had to keep some of the chokecherries. So that was my first decision, was to keep some of the chokecherries. And it was fascinating to watch. So I'm just going to show you what chokecherries look like, in case you don't know. So this is the plant. And you can see that those are the berries. And several years ago, I had a couple come and ask me whether they could pick some chokecherries on Parsons Field. And I said, yes, I have many chokecherries. You can pick as many as you want, if you can get there before the birds and the bears and whatever. So they came back the next year and said they had won first prize at the Skowhegan Fair making chokecherry jelly. So that was very fun. But the other thing that's interesting about this plant, if you notice, is look at this. Doesn't that look ugly? Well, guess what? A lot of people think that's a brown-tailed moth nest, But actually it's not. That's actually a native tent caterpillar nest. The tent caterpillars have long gone, but it's one of the first things that hatches out for caterpillars on the field is the tent caterpillars. And once I started letting some of the chokecherries grow enough to be big enough that we got tent caterpillars and we got berries, I started having many more birds on the field. But it was fascinating because the first year the chokecherries got big enough, I left chokecherries mostly along the road, also to give some buffer to the field as far as noise. I would have birds lined up on the telephone poles in the spring, flying onto the field to get food. And one of the things you have to understand, our birds are disappearing, but the seed-eating birds are not disappearing. It's the insect-eating birds that are disappearing. And one of the things that's very interesting is that almost all birds feed their babies caterpillars. So there was a very interesting study where they just put a camera next to a chickadee box, and you can't tell from a camera whether it's a male or female coming to the box to feed babies. They just counted the numbers of caterpillars that a pair of chickadees feeds to one clutch or one nest full of babies. So what they found was one pair of chickadees needs between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to feed their babies just to get to the point where they fledge the nest. And they usually feed them for an additional 3 weeks after that. So the number of caterpillars that just one couple of birds need to feed their babies is remarkable. So it was amazing to see all the birds lined up on the telephone poles when it was nesting season. And they were coming on to Parsons Field, as far as I could tell, and getting caterpillars and then going back to wherever the nest was, which was not on Parsons Field. So one of the things that I eventually did is put bird boxes up on Parsons Field. I now have 6 bird boxes, 5 designed for bluebirds, 1 for wrens, and had a wren this year, house wren. And 4 of my other 5 bluebird boxes were taken mostly by bluebirds and by tree swallows. So one of the things I'm trying to do is trying to encourage birds and encourage insects, but one of the things you have to really think about is caterpillars. And so we have tent caterpillars, and then the next nest after that was the ugly nest moths. And you can imagine what the ugly nests look like because they're called ugly nests, right? And it was fascinating. I don't know if I can find an ugly nest because they've pretty much, in the last week or so, they've all disappeared as well. But it's a little bit different nest than the tent caterpillars. And it was just interesting to watch, you know. So one of the things you have to really think about, especially if it's in your yard, is a different relationship with caterpillars. And you have to understand that caterpillars need a host plant, which means that's the plant that they eat the leaves of. And I would have people calling me and saying, the chokecherries are all dying, they're covered with these nests. And it was like, yep, but they'll recover, they're fine, but we have plenty of chokecherries. We need the caterpillars for the birds, right? So it's very, very interesting. Now we do have possibility of invasive as well. We have not seen any brown-tailed moths, for instance. If I saw a brown-tailed moth nest, I would take it off. That's an invasive species and it's kind of nasty. But so far we don't have any, so I'm just hoping that that will stay for a long time. So the other thing was interesting. So we were mowing every fall to keep the field open, which sounds like a good idea, and I would say chances are most people, that's what they do. But if you look at species of bees, they need something to eat from the spring until they winter over, right? So if you mow down the fall blooming flowers, for instance, it doesn't help the bees or the butterflies people think about butterflies like monarch butterflies and they want to plant milkweeds, which is great. Milkweed is the host plant, and it's not just common milkweed, which is the most common one. It's all of the different milkweeds. I think I have 4 milkweeds now on the field. But once the butterflies hatch, the butterflies need nectar. And that means that they need nectar so they can get to Mexico so they can start the whole cycle over again, right? So you don't just need the milkweeds, you need something for nectar. And one of the most common things that they use for nectar in the fall are asters. If you mow down the asters, it doesn't do any good to plant the milkweeds because the adult butterflies can't fly back to Mexico. So you have to sort of think about the whole ecosystem and how things work. So let's just talk about bees for a moment. So bees, when people think about bees, our bees are disappearing as well. People think about honeybees, but honeybees are not a native species. Honeybees are raised and they're put in boxes and they create honey. And I've been a beekeeper myself in the past. A lot of work to do bees. But what's disappearing are not the honeybees. In fact, the honeybees actually are increasing, especially with COVID. A lot of people started keeping bees. It's our native bees that are disappearing. And native bees are very important to pollination. So we need to think about what we can do for our native bees. There was a very interesting study recently in Britain that looked at native bees that just in that 1 month, they lost 65% of their bees. They died. 65% of their bees died in that 1 month. So they said, I wonder if we just plant early blooming species of trees or flowers and see whether it helps the population of bees. And they just started they calculated what they thought the bees would need and then they planted spring blooming flowers. And guess what? After 10 years, they had no loss of bees. So they went from losing 2/3 of their bees to losing none of them. So just focusing on planting flowers that bloom early in the spring can make a huge difference for our bees. But we also need things that bloom late in the fall, because that's important too. They have to have enough energy to make it through the winter. And it's interesting because you think about native bees, a lot of them nest in rotting wood. They nest in the ground. A lot of the bumblebee queens winter over underground, or maybe they live in the base of grasses, especially clumping grasses. Some insects live in stems of flowers. So if you cut everything down in the fall, then you don't have the stems. You don't have the things that bloom, right? So you have to sort of rethink what you're doing and how it can affect the bees. So one of the things that I did in Parsons was I kept some of the chokecherries, which is a keystone plant. If you look at the keystone trees, oaks are by far the most important. If you're going to plant one thing in your lifetime to help your insects, plant an oak tree. But you have to plant 2 to get acorns, or at least 2. If you're worried about oaks falling over, you can plant 2 or 3 together in a clump, and they're less likely because the roots will mesh. But if you do anything, if you want to plant one thing, plant an oak tree. That's just the most important. But cherry trees and willows are the others that are very important for butterfly species. And then there are lots of keystone flowers as well. So if you look at the keystone flowers that support the most insects, it's asters, goldenrods, and sunflowers. So when I started working on Parsons, one of the things that I did was I actually just looked at the field, what's growing where, and was very fascinating. We had someone from the Xerxes Society come out, which is the organization that helps insects. And they noticed that we have an unusual aster growing on Parsons Field, which is called flax-leaved stiff aster. And we have little blue stem growing on the field. And that's probably been growing there for thousands of years. It's interesting because little blue stem is one of the main grasses in all the prairies out west. So it's very unusual to see little blue stem growing in Somerset County. So once I realized that, I started talking to an organization called Wild Seed Project, which is a nonprofit in Portland area that's trying to get people to plant native perennials. And they also collect native seeds. So I asked them whether they would like seeds from the aster that's growing here or from little blue stem, and they said yes. So I've been collecting seeds for them of those plants every year, and some other plants as well, depending on what they need and what I have available. Last year was very fun because I've been planting native perennials now for several years, and we were able to collect seeds from 6 species of our plants and planted them out on Parsons again. This year we raised 2,000 native perennial seedlings mostly at the high school greenhouse. And I started along with one of the teachers at the high school, a horticultural program for students who want to learn how to plant plants. And we just had our first graduate from the extension service who spent 150 hours after doing an online course and learning how to raise plants, plant plants, take down invasive plants. So that was very fun. So we've planted most of our native perennials so far this year. We still have a few flats of them to plant out. So let's just walk down the path. So basically, when I looked at Parsons Field, I started studying like how we should design it. And there was a landscape architect who designed a lot of outdoor spaces for like botanical gardens and that kind of thing. And one of the things that he said that really stuck with me was that if you have a path, make it turn, because every time it turns, you see a different view. So I said, we could do that. So we're going to go down this path, and then it's going to turn, and it's going to go through the chokecherries. And when the chokecherries bloomed this spring, it was stunning because there were so many bees that it was like a cloud of gnats. I don't know if you've ever experienced a cloud of gnats, but there were hundreds, and I just walked down this path. Now the chokecherries all have berries on them, or a lot of them do. But I stood here and it was just surrounded by bees. All kinds. A few honeybees, rare. We do have a church up the road has hives on the field, 2 hives. But it was bumblebees of all shapes and sizes, mostly medium to small size bumblebees, and then all kinds of other native bees. So that was very fascinating. Now right now the meadowsweet is blooming, so you can see a couple insects here on this one. And sometimes you can just stand and look at the meadowsweet wherever it's blooming, and it'll be covered with bees. So we're going to walk up here. One of the things that I'm trying to do, there's all these little sandy knolls on Parsons Field. And a lot of the unusual asters grow on those knolls, but this knoll was almost completely denuded. So I had to put a fence around it, and it was being denuded by ATVs and by dirt bikes. And now I've reestablished the asters on that. And so hopefully in a few years, there are quite a few asters there, but it's going to be a while before we'll get some more. Now it's interesting because when we first acquired the field, we planted some flowers out here. And you can see this flower, for instance, it's a liatris. This is called prairie blazing star. It's a beautiful plant. But the interesting thing about prairie blazing star is it's not a native plant, which we didn't realize. Very hard to find native plants to purchase at some of the nurseries. There is a blazing star that's native to Somerset County. It's called Northern Blazing Star. We planted a bunch of them out last year. I have one that survived, but it got eaten by the deer. So the plant's this tall, but no flowers this year. And the other one is on another property Somerset Woods owns right down the road. So hopefully in a few years we'll have some, or we'll grow some more next year. But we're not going to take this down. It's not an invasive plant. We'll talk about that in a minute. And for the most part, I would say, ooh, look at the blueberries. That's a high bush blueberry.
I was going to say, it doesn't look native.
Well, we have lots of native blueberries as well that are blooming. Oh, there's a butterfly of some kind. Maybe a morning cloak. That's what it looks like. Nice. I usually see 6 to 8 species of butterflies almost every time that I'm out here. So that's fun. So one of the things that we started last year was we call a perennial flower garden. Because most people have a flower garden around their house. And so I wanted to have as a demonstration project what it might like to have a perennial flower garden. And this doesn't look like much. I mean, the black-eyed Susans are beautiful, but I didn't actually plant those in this garden. But I planted all kinds of plants in this garden, which you can't even tell yet, like butterfly weed and all kinds of things. But it takes 3 to 5 years before you plant a perennial garden before things really start to bloom. And then you have to figure out what you want there and move things around like anything else. The general rule for a perennial flower garden is to plant things close together, have something that blooms all year, and have waves. Like if you're going to have a butterfly weed, have a couple of butterfly weeds throughout. Or if you're going to have lobelia, put it, throughout. So if you look, for instance, you can see there's some echinacea here that we planted in the middle of the black-eyed Susans. We have some Virginia mountain mint, which has several bees. A false sunflower. Now we talked about how sunflowers are a keystone species. False sunflowers are not a keystone species, but they're actually very high up, like in the top 10% of flowers that are good for pollinators. And even though it's not native to Somerset County, it's native very close to here. Oh, you can look at the bumblebee on the bee balm. Ah, nice. So the way that I did this perennial garden, first of all, I had to dig up the chokecherries, which is a lot of work. But then to smother the grass that was here, which was non-native grass, I put down 3 layers of newspaper and then I put down cardboard. And it was a lot of, it seemed like it would, and then I left it for 2 years. I wouldn't do it again because the cardboard flew off several times and it took 2 years before everything was pretty much gone and I could then plant. But if I had a small space to do again, I would probably do it again. I just wouldn't do a big space like this. Now, because the chokecherries have rhizomes, which are like roots under the ground, I had to actually put edging all around, so the chokecherry roots would not get into this area. But you can see that this is sort of similar thing I'm doing this year. We had a leftover tarp. So in a couple of years, we'll plant that, and then the grass will be gone. So how do I choose what to plant? So one of the things that I do is try to plant keystone species. That makes sense. Things that bloom early, things that bloom late. Then I also try to plant species that are endangered or extinct, that used to be here. And if I can get seeds, sometimes it takes me several years to get seeds. But one of the plants that we've been planting now for several years is our native lupin. So sundial lupin looks like this. We grew these from seeds last year. They're only blue. They're not as showy as the western lupin, which is what you probably are used to seeing. We have 3 plants from last year that survived, and we have 1 plant in this area that survived this year, right here. So it doesn't look like much, but once it gets established, it does quite well. They have very deep roots. Most of the plants that I plant are prairie plants, so they have very deep roots, and they're very good at sequestering carbon, which is also good. One of the other plants that we planted this year, have for several years, is great blue lobelia, which is a glorious plant. It's now considered extinct. Last year was considered critically endangered. And we grew probably 400 of them this year. So we're planting them anywhere we can find. They bloom for about 2 months, and the bees and the butterflies love the lobelia. We planted some in here in several places. See if I can find it. Echinacea. Here's one. Doesn't look like much now, but they grow about 2 feet tall. Here's another one. Here's another one. So once they get established, they do quite well as well, which is fun. I also have, one of the things that I've noticed when I started watching the birds is that they like to have perches so they can sort of see what's going on. And lots of times they'll fly into the woods to get some protection, like a hawk flies over, that kind of thing. So I've been planting some islands of shrubs. And I actually have a critically endangered serviceberry, which is considered a small tree, large shrub, that I got from a nursery in Connecticut. It is native to Somerset County. And I also planted some cinquefoil or potentilla over there. And then I have a couple other islands of shrubs and trees that I'm letting grow to give some protection. I put some of my bird boxes over in that area, so then if they see a predator, when the trees and the shrubs get big enough, hopefully they'll be able to fly in, get some protection. So when we talk about native perennials, which is basically what we're planting here, a perennial is a flower that comes up every year. An annual is a flower that you have to plant every year. So a native perennial means that it's native to your area, or at least it's native close by, so that likely the insects that are here and the butterflies that are here have adapted to those plants. So so it goes both ways. Because it pollinates the flowers, helps the plants, but it also helps the insects and the butterflies. So there's also non-native plants, which means a plant from away. But non-natives don't necessarily harm the environment. But there's also invasive plants, and we have more and more invasive plants. And some of the invasive plants actually push out the natives. So invasive plants in general you want to avoid. And if you have them on your property, if you can remove them, it's very helpful. There's been many studies now that show that if you have a ecosystem that has invasives, it does not do as well as far as biodiversity of insects, birds, and other animals than if you have a ecosystem that doesn't have invasives. And the general rule for what you want to plant, say in your flower garden, is you want to have at least 70% of your plants, native plants, and you can have up to 30% non-natives as long as they're not invasive. And that's sort of where the tipping point is for whether the insects and birds do well, especially the insects. So what I do is when I plant something on Parsons is for the first year, and these are plants that should grow here naturally, right? But for the first year, I put a marker. Like this is a foxglove beard tongue, which is a nice little plant. It's already bloomed. That has little white flowers. The insects love it. It grows about 2 feet tall. So I put a marker for 2 reasons. One, I know where they are. No one runs over them or walks on them, but I also can water them if it's a dry year. So the first year that I retired and had time to really spend on Parsons Field, we'll see in a minute, I planted ½ acre of native prairie plants. And you may not understand that we actually have prairie plants that are native to Maine. You just don't see that ecosystem very often, but this is like the perfect place for that, and there are already native prairie plants growing on Parsons Field. But that year was incredibly dry. So for the first few months, I would water every other day because I planted 5,000 seedlings. And if I had not until they got well established, they would have died. So I put markers, and then if it hasn't rained for a couple of days for the first few months that they're on the field, then I water them so I know where they are. So that just helps me. And then at the end of the fall, I just pull all the stakes, and then I use them again next year. So this, for instance, is a New England aster, which is one of the latest blooming asters, although I just found another one that I'm going to try to get seeds for next year that apparently even blooms later than New England aster. But every New England aster I had in the field, which were about 6 last year, I'd grown them all from seeds, would be covered with butterflies and bees because it was one of the few things that was really blooming in the fall. So it was glorious. I mean, they were like 3 or 4 feet tall. So I saved seeds from 2 of them last year, and we planted a bunch of them out this year. And here's another native bee balm. Only the pink bee balm is native. There's actually a non-native species of bee balm, which is more likely that you're going to find at the nursery. So try to get the native plants if you can. And again, here's looks like some Japanese beetles, which is an invasive insect. But look at these little, I don't know, they're not bees, they're some kind of insect, but I don't know. It's always fascinating spending time out here because you always see something new. This I call the meadow. It's basically a native prairie that we planted, and we'll go up on that little knoll and get a better look in a minute. But you have to understand that this whole area was covered with chokecherries and non-native grass, because this is probably where they grazed cattle or whatever they grazed when this was a farm many, many years ago. Because when we actually planted this, and we'll talk about that in a minute, there were several kinds of barbed wire and fencing and whatever, all in this area, right? So you can see, last year I worked on this area taking out the choke cherries because we had originally planted half an acre, and I'm increasing the meadow this year to include this triangle in between the places to walk. And you can see the roots of the chokecherry, which I just left because there are a lot of bees that nest in rotting wood. So it helps the environment, plus it has places for snakes to hide and whatever. So you can see all the orange flags were all plants that we planted this year. And then again, you can see some of the chokecherries. But you notice the path curved, so now you get a different view. And you can get a view of the meadow. And it's really glorious to watch because, first it's the foxglove beard tongue, and then it's the Virginia mountain mint and the black-eyed Susans and the fall sunflowers in the back, and the echinacea just starting to bloom, and the what else is blooming? I can't think. But then eventually it'll be asters and whatever. Now the sod was so thick in that area, and there were so many chokecherries, that we tried various ways to dig it up, which were impossible. So one of the neighbors who lives down the road is a dairy farmer, and he volunteered his time to come out and actually tilled up this whole area, but left some meadowsweet in the middle, which is fun, so that will continue to grow and be there. And he had to plow it twice and till it, and then eventually this half we had to actually rototill as well. And then we raked sod for many hours that summer, and then we planted, and the half on the left we planted 3,000 seedlings, had a work day just planting seedlings. And then on the right hand side we planted 2,000 more seedlings we had raised from seeds, so they're much smaller, so it took another year basically to bloom. And then we seeded it. And you can create a meadow just by using seeds and not planting any seedlings. It just takes longer to get them established, and you have to use lots of seeds. In general, about 90 to 95% of seeds will get eaten by something else, or they won't germinate. So it takes a lot of seeds. But you can get, for instance, a seed mix for native plants from the Northeast, and that's what I basically did. And I would plant the seedlings, I would seed it with annuals, so they would have something to grow. And the most common annuals that I used would be cosmos or partridge pea. And then in the fall I would seed it again, and then in the spring I would seed it again. And the general rule is that the first 5 years that you create a meadow, you should actually mow it in the spring, which is exactly what I said you shouldn't do. But you don't mow it until after you see your first bee emerge and on the field. So basically you mow it every spring for 5 years. And I made a mistake. You actually, instead of mowing in the fall, which is what a lot of people do, the best time to mow a field, is all the webinars I've gone to suggest that you should mow it in the spring, and you should mow in general 1/3 of your field every 3 years. And that keeps the trees out, but it also protects the insects that are there living on that part of the field. So last year I mowed this part of the field. This year I mowed this part of the field, and then next year I'll mow the next part, and then we'll rotate, except for the meadow, which we have been mowing every year. So this is an area when we would sit on the field and plant or dig up sod or whatever we were doing, we had 2 clutches of bluebirds hatch out one year, and there was 3 each time. So we'd have 6 baby bluebirds on the field, and they would spend so much time on these little posts, which I was just cordoning off for people to avoid, but you can see all the bird poop because the bluebirds are still sitting on there. I had one on the other day. So I decided this would be an area where I'd actually plant a small clump of of shrubs and trees. So I actually have a more common serviceberry now, an American serviceberry growing here. I've got 2 New Jersey teas, which is a very small shrub, native to southern Maine, not to Somerset County, but very close. And then I have 3 dogwoods in here. I have some Joe Pye weed, which is another kind of milkweed. And I think I've got 4 or 5 of them growing. And then I put in some echinacea and a few other things as well. Here's another, bee on one of the echinaceas. So hopefully in a few years, this will be like a huge area with shrubs, and the birds will enjoy it even more. Now it's interesting, we talk about dogwoods. So one of the things that they found doing research is that the berries on non-native shrubs are quite different than berries on native shrubs. And probably the most common thing that we see for invasives is honeysuckle. There are some native honeysuckles, but most of the honeysuckle you see growing around is non-native. And people were encouraged to plant honeysuckle, thinking it was good for the birds and it was a good hedge, and we just didn't know any better. But it's interesting that honeysuckle berries, or no, I should say the studies show berries from Eurasia are very high in carbohydrates, but very low in fat, as opposed to dogwood berries, which is, we have a lot of native dogwoods, are very high in fat. So if you're trying to fly and migrate to South America or make it through the winter, it's important to have berries that are higher in fat. So just having the native berries planted is very helpful for the birds. Now this area looks odd because it's like a plastic mat, right? And that actually is what it is. So one of the webinars that I took during COVID was talking about how to rewild large spaces. And it was run by someone who actually had gone to the University of Maine and was now working for Norcross, which is a large land trust, I think in upstate New York. And what they were using a lot is these mats, which are mostly used for agriculture. And I got that at Johnny's Seeds online. So basically what they're doing, what it does is it has a white side, which this part of it's not all the way out yet. And then it has a black side. And the white side encourages all the seeds that are in the soil to germinate. But then the black side doesn't allow them to germinate. So it basically sterilizes that area without having to dig it up. And usually when they're used for agriculture, my understanding is they only have to use them for a month or so. But for something like this, they recommend at least 3 months. I still had a few choke cherries to dig up, however, so we couldn't put it all the way down. I worked on that a couple of days ago. And so by next week, we'll have that whole area. But this is sort of where the native grasses start, and this is where the non-native grasses start, and that's where the fencing was. So my guess is that was the grazing area. If you look up here and just look across, that was all choke cherries and non-native grass. And if you go down the field farther, you'll see lots of choke cherries. And here's some choke cherries growing in there as well as some other plants. So we tried various techniques for getting rid of the choke cherries. Mowing did not work, which is what they tried for years. And what I actually found was digging them up by hand worked the best, which sounds really crazy. But I'm going to show you some of the tools in a minute that I used to work on this field that are remarkable tools. Very, very helpful. So basically, you can see the meadow and hopefully eventually a lot of Parsons Field. If you, like we talked about a perennial flower garden, you want your plants close together, you usually want to have larger plants in the back, you want to have smaller plants in the front, you might want a ground cover to cover in between your plants. When you plant a meadow, if you want to plant a meadow, they recommend that 70% of your plants are grass. And you should have a minimum of 3 native grasses growing. So what I did for this area is I actually either purchased little blue stem seedlings or transplanted some little blue stem seedlings. I used another native grass with seeds, and then I collected seeds from another grass that's growing in this part of the field, but I actually do not know if it's a native grass. So those are the grasses that I used. So it's interesting. So this is the native grass that's growing. This is little blue stem. And it was interesting that I went online to try to figure out if you could transplant them because I have thousands of little blue stem. And what they said was take a mature plant, cut it up in small bits and plant it out, and I got none of them to survive. But what I found was if I took some smaller plants, they all survived, which was fascinating. So I ended up transplanting some of it. This is the aster. This is unusual. Looks like little pine trees, but that's the flax-leaved stiff aster, and has beautiful little blue flowers, light blue flowers. And it's really fascinating. If you want to look at Parsons Field, one time of the year, come out like late August. Stand on this knoll right here and look across the field. The entire field is blue. It is remarkable, truly remarkable. And one time the neighbor came over and he said, "Do you know what these asters are?" Because this is before I knew much. And I said, "I have no idea." And he said, one time he came out here and someone was mowing the field and mowing all the asters down. And he said, "You can't, you're mowing the asters." And he said, "I was paid to mow this field, and I will mow this field." And he mowed them all down. So now we know better. But it's interesting because there's a lot to learn, right? So in the springtime, a lot of this is very sandy soils. And in the springtime, a lot of the bees, the native bees, nest underground and basically have holes that look like ant holes from an ant nest. And it's fascinating. You'll come out and a lot of the areas that they end up using are these sandy areas in the path. So you have to sort of, and you see lots of bees coming out of the ground. And then you realize they all have nests under there and they're raising their babies and then, so, and it's interesting that most of the ground nesting bees are not aggressive, so they're not going to sting you. That's what's, it's like everyone's very afraid, which is understandable, but actually they nest in the ground and they are not aggressive as long as you don't bother them. They're just trying to feed their babies. So they're going onto the field and foraging, trying to find plants that are blooming, and then they're going to feed their babies. So Parsons Field does have a vernal pool. There's a little clump of trees, like a little island of trees right there. There's actually a vernal pool behind those trees. And those of you who don't know what a vernal pool is, it's basically a temporary pond. And the nice thing about vernal pools is that a lot of the salamanders, toads, frogs will lay their eggs in the vernal pools and they'll hopefully hatch out before the pool dries up, but there's no predators. Plus, there might be things like mosquito larvae, and they'll be able to, so there's lots of food for them to eat. So people think, oh, a vernal pool, I'll be covered with mosquitoes, but actually you aren't, because all the salamanders and the tadpoles are all eating all those mosquito larvae. So that's Parsons Field, so you can get a sense of it. There's lots of, what we're going to do is go back to the meadow, and I'm going to show you some of the tools that I've used on Parsons that have been very helpful to me, and show you some of the books that I use, so you can, in case you want to read more or think about.
Pause for now. Should
Okay,
I pause?
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to show you some of the tools that I've used, which I found really helpful. Is something called an uprooter. They come in various sizes. I have 2 sizes. This is the largest uprooter. And I ended up seeing some webinar on for some land trust who was taking down invasives. And if you have a tree or small shrub that has a single stem, you basically put the stem in here, in the jaws. You close it up over the stem, and all you do is lift it up. And this can take down a small sapling that's probably about 15 feet tall. And then the smaller one is not quite as heavy, so if I have a smaller tree that I want to take down. But it doesn't, I tried it for the chokecherries. For roots that are under the ground, it just doesn't work for that. But it will pull up a tree, a small tree or a shrub that's like one single stem. So the other thing that I have, they now make electric either chainsaws or loppers, and that is a lifesaver because this thing will go through almost anything. You have to be careful because it'll take off your finger if you're not careful. But this one you have to have both of them down, so it's a safety thing. So, but that is very helpful as well. So if I want to like take down some chokecherries but not dig them up, I can do that. Or if I have another small tree, I want to take off some limbs, like it's in the pathway, things like that. So I have not gotten a small chainsaw. I have friends who have, but you have to, it's the same issue with the chainsaw blade. You have to be able to sharpen it and all that kind of stuff. So for me, it was just too much work. But this worked very well for me for what I'm doing. So it just gives you some idea. I mean, sometimes I have a straight shovel for edging. So for instance, this area, I left the chokecherries, but I didn't want it into the meadow. So I actually put 1 foot edging down, and it worked. So far, it's worked incredibly well to keep the chokecherry roots from coming onto the meadow. So hopefully that will continue to be the case. So if you are thinking about doing something like this, start small. Think about what you want. Look at what you have now. If you have any plants that are invasive plants, and it's easy to determine that if you don't know there's various apps now that are free that you can take a picture of a plant. It'll tell you exactly what it is. You can go to another site like Go Botany, which is one of my favorites. It'll actually have maps of where it's native or whether it's native or not, and you can actually see whether it's native to Somerset County or not. Or you can look up the plant and see whether or not it's an invasive plant. If you really love the plant, like I love impatiens can live in the shade, and 30% of your plants are non-native, great, that's perfect. So it doesn't mean you have to give up your favorite plants. But if there's an alternative, it's very helpful. When you go to a nursery, oftentimes they'll have an area now that says native plants, but I would say 90% or more of them are usually not native to Somerset County or to Maine. So that's what's very difficult. So what I do now is I actually look at the label on the plants. It'll usually have the Latin name. Look it up. If it's a non-native lupin, don't plant it. That's considered an invasive plant. Lots of times if you want the native plant these days, you have to grow it yourself. not always. There are some places now. And the Wild Seed Project, which I talked about earlier, does have lists of nurseries in Maine that sell native plants. So if you're looking for a particular plant, you can often go online and look at what they have, or they'll have plant sales, that kind of thing. So my Bible for creating the meadow is a book called Lawns into Meadows, which was actually written by Owen Wormser, who grew up in Mercer, Maine. So that's very fun because I didn't know Owen well, but I knew his parents a little bit. And his father was the poet laureate at one point of the state of Maine, which was really fun. So Owen is now a landscape architect, lives in Western Massachusetts, and wrote this book, which now has another edition. And basically, I read this book about 4 times before I planted this meadow. And it was very helpful, just sort of describing what plants you could plant and when they bloom, and what to do and how many, what kind of grasses you could plant that are native and all those kinds of things. So that was very helpful for me, and I know that people have gotten it at the library as well. So if you want a book, if you want to create a meadow, that was very, very helpful. They also have lots of webinars. What I found is there were lots of webinars, especially from Britain, on creating meadows. Maybe there's more now from the US, but when I was looking at this 3 or 4 years ago, it was remarkable how many of them were from England mostly. So there's the Wild Seed Project, has many small books on various topics. So for instance, if you want to plant some native trees and trying to figure out what to plant, they have a whole book on all the trees and like what the trees look like and how tall they grow and what, they grow in the sun or the shade, that kind of thing. They have ones on ground covers. They have ones on shrubs. Their latest one is called Planting for Climate Resilience. So they have online resources. They have videos you can watch on how to plant native perennials. So they are very, very helpful. And if you have some unusual plants growing in your area, they're always looking for people to collect seeds, but they do want the person to be approved and then know what they're collecting, right? Because they want to be able to collect seeds that will survive and that are actually the seeds that they're claiming to be. Of all the books that I've read about our insect and our what we can do to help butterflies, bees, moths, Doug Ptolemy is an entomologist, and he's written many books, and this is one of them. He has one book just on landscaping ideas for landscaping around your house that he co-authored with a landscape architect. But this talks about a lot of the things I talked about today. And it basically, the nice thing about his books are it gives you hope that we can do things, that we can change things. We can actually create a habitat around our house that's not only beautiful, but can help our birds, can help our bees and other pollinators, can help our insects, that we don't have to have this, all these animals go extinct. And if everybody pitches in and plants some plants around their house, we're going to be much better off in the long run. So it really gives you hope. And it's really, and I have to say, being out here, it's quite fun. And not only is that, it's good for your health to be outside and to spend time looking at the pollinators, looking at the bees, looking at the butterflies and the moths is quite fun. So hopefully you'll decide to do some of this yourself. And if you have questions, besides these books, Maine Audubon now has a site on their webpage where you can look up native flowers. So let's say you want a flower that is 2 feet tall and is blue and blooms in May, and it's in sandy soils. You push a button for all those different categories and it gives you a list, right? Or maybe you want a yellow flower that's 3 feet tall that grows in the shade, right? Or you want something that blooms late or that blooms early. And then or you want something for the front of your flower garden or the back of your flower garden. Very, very helpful. So you just check the different categories and it just comes up with lists, and then you can look for those plants. And if you can't find the plants, maybe you can get some seeds and start some seeds yourself next year. It was amazing how easy it is to start seeds, but these are plants that like to grow here, right? These are native plants that are supposed to be growing in Somerset County. So it makes sense that they're actually, for the most part, easy to grow. We planted 22 species of native perennials this year and got probably 17 to grow. So that was fun. Now some of them, there are only a few plants, but that's okay. One of the plants I've been trying to grow for like 4 years now is something called Indian grass, which now has a new name, which is good. And my brother, who's a botanist and knows a lot about prairie plants, said if Indian grass is native, you should try to plant it. So it turns out that it's critically endangered. It's native to Somerset County. It actually grows within a mile of Parsons Field. And I have one growing at home at the moment. I have grown 3 over the last 3 or 4 years. None of them have survived that I can figure. So this year I'm going to try again. Every year I try to plant it again. But it should eventually grow, and once it grows, it has 6-foot deep roots. And they say it's very hard to get rid of once you have it growing, so you know what? That's okay. It'll be perfect for Parsons Field. Thank you very much for coming.